Hi everyone, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're watching from. It's so lovely to have you here today. How are you doing? So, I'm glad with you to join us because we're talking about a very interesting topic, which is dealing with emotional abuse. My name is Nonye Ukwuoma. For some of us that do not know me, I am a clinical psychologist and a relationship expert with over 13 years experience in behavioral research. I am the lead consultant with 360 Psyche. For us to really understand the concept, I want us to take our time to watch this video. Now, this video actually popped up when I was trying to prepare for this training. And this is a classic case of emotional abuse. I know some of us would say, they're just cruising, no, I'm meant, but of course, the dog obviously was looking out for affection, and the person in the video was intentionally withholding affection from the dog and giving it to the cat. And I would have expected the video to end a different way, but it ended even to the point where the person never acknowledged the dog. That is classic emotional abuse. So, in order for us to understand emotional abuse and how to manage, we're going to be looking at this topic from five central points. One, what is emotional abuse and what is not? It's important for us to be able to make that distinction. Two, how can we identify emotional abuse? Unlike other forms of abuse, such as physical abuse, emotional abuse can be a little bit more difficult to identify. Then, what are the effects of emotional abuse? Because the thing is, the effects of emotional abuse cuts across different areas: our physical health, our mental health, our social health. Then, of course, we're going to look at how we can manage emotional abuse by ourselves, self help tips we can use. Then, finally, we're going to talk about how we can prevent being emotionally abused or stop it. Now, this particular point came much later when I got someone asking me, Nonye, how do you think I can prevent myself from being gaslighted? And it got me thinking. Prevention, from what I understand in public health, is better than cure. So it's important for us to learn how to prevent, even as we're learning how to manage. So when we're talking about the entire concept of emotional abuse, it's important for us to think of it in these two central points: emotions and abuse. Our classic definition of what emotions are would be emotions are feelings, yeah? Right. Now, emotions are very critical to who we are as human beings, and I will paint a picture to how important it is. Now, some years back, a man got involved in an accident, and unfortunately, a part of the man's brain was damaged, and it got people worried. Maybe it wasn't going to function as it should. But they noticed that after the man was healed, the aspect that was responsible for intelligence wasn't affected at all. As a matter of fact, it was okay. But what they noticed was that the man found it difficult to even do very little tasks like making decisions. For example, making decisions of should I eat bread or rice for dinner, or should I try out should I wear a yellow shirt, or should I go visiting. It was kind of difficult for the man to make those decisions. Now, it would seem out of place considering a man that has his intelligence not affected. But then they realized that the actual part of the brain that was affected was the part responsible for emotion. So the fact that the part responsible for emotion, it actually thwarted anything that had to do with intelligence, because emotions are key part of us as human beings. So we would usually say that we are emotional beings, meaning that our decisions, our actions, are everything we do. I'm almost tempted to say most things, but I would want to prefer to say everything, because there is some form of emotion. Now, it all depends if we manage it. So, because of how strong emotions are to everything we do, we now look at the other word we want to us to pay attention to, which is abuse. Now, there are so many definitions of what can classify as abuse. Some people will call it misuse of something, some will call it misappropriation, some will call it negligence. But the general notion in which they are trying to paint for the word abuse is the person receiving the abuse is not benefiting, or whatever is receiving the abuse is not benefiting. So let's put those two words together. Emotions. I don't want to go into what the psychological definition of emotions are in order not to bore us, but generally we will classify emotions as feelings. So when we say our feelings are being misused, this should form a basis for us throughout our discussion. Now, let's talk about what is emotional abuse. Many definitions can come up to what we can classify as emotional abuse. But emotional abuse is a form of abuse, meaning that there are all the types of abuse. Of course, we know there's physical abuse. Physical abuse can yes, most likely come with emotional abuse, but there are two different things. We have financial abuse, we have technological abuse. Now, what we are focusing on is emotional abuse, which is a form of abuse that is characterized by the use of words, actions, or lack of actions to manipulate, control, or harm another person's emotions, self-esteem, and well-being. This now takes me back to the video we initially watched. Lack of action to manipulate. Of course, that was a clear example where the person was trying to manipulate the dog's emotions. I'm sorry, I'm just going back there because I so much love dogs and it hurts me actually watching that. Emotional abuse can come and happen in different ways. It can start with you can have emotional abuse like humiliation, where we negate or criticize, control and shame, accusing, blaming, denial, emotional neglect, and isolation. Now, I know some of those words that we use in this definition of what is emotional abuse can stand on its own. For example, constructive criticism. We may not want to classify that as emotional abuse, but of course, some aspects such as humiliation obviously falls under emotional abuse. So when we are discussing types of emotional abuse and how to identify, of course, we'll make a distinction in that. But emotional abuse can happen in any kind of relationship. It doesn't only involve romantic relationship or a parent and a child relationship, even friendships, business relationships, acquaintances. There are tendencies that emotional abuse will come up there. Now, the unfortunate part of emotional abuse is it can have a quite long lasting effect on the victim's mental health and their sense of self worth. So, this is why we're really talking about and how we can manage it. Now, how can we manage? How can we identify, emotional abuse? Now, because we know that a lot of things can have dotted lines, and unlike physical abuse, it's easier to identify. Emotional abuse is a little bit more difficult. So, the first one is we would concentrate on is humiliation. Before I go on, I just want you to know that this is not an exhaustive list of how we can identify emotional abuse. The first one is humiliation, where the abuser frequently belittles, criticizes, insults, or humiliates the victim. You see them laughing at the victim, calling them names. The aim right now is to demean or undermine the person's self-worth, more like making them seem lesser than how they are, or making them seem lesser than themselves. So if I'm supposed to be high up here, so I'm going to try and bring you down here because we can't be on the same space or even close. You have to be down. So when this happens, that is some level of humiliation. Now, it may not come directly, and I like this example very well because it almost seems like the person is caring about you when they say, "Oh, I don't think you have the brain power to understand what I'm saying. But what I'm trying to say is this. Of course, innocent talk, right? I'm looking out for you. I don't think you have the brain power." That is some level of humiliation right there. Because the intention, even if they would choose to admit it or not, is to belittle the person. Because why do you have to start with that? I don't think you have the brain power to understand that. Now we talk about emotional blackmail as the other form of emotional abuse. This is where the abuser may intentionally withhold affection, emotional support, or intimacy as a means of control. I am going to control how you would do, or I will withhold something from you in order to direct how you would act or not act. Now, this is an emotional blackmail, and it's some level of control, the need for control, some level of need of control is there. I keep saying it because it's kind of important. For example, in a romantic relationship, you say, if you don't have sex with me in this way or at this time or anytime I want, I'm going to find it somewhere else. That is an emotional blackmail. Or if you don't do what I want, if you don't do what I want, if you don't attend to these things the way I want, I'm going to get a divorce. Oh, you have been doing this, you have been doing this, I'm going to, and that is why the person will break up, make up multiple times, demanding something to control the narrative. That is some form of emotional abuse. And the intention is to control the narrative, and that is not cool. Some people do it without knowing it, but of course, it doesn't negate the fact that it's emotional abuse. Now, the third factor, the third part is intimidation and fear, where the emotional abuser often use intimidation and threats to instill some level of fear in the victim. Where you see them and they will yell, they will scream, they will destroy personal property or their own property, they will display aggressive behavior. Now, the difference between this one and actual physical abuse is that you are not being abused directly. It is just the display of the actions, the yelling, the hitting of the table, the running around, but it is not actually direct. It doesn't come physical. When it does come physical, of course, it's going to be a link between physical and emotional abuse. But the most likely reason for this is to instill some level of fear in the victim. So when the victim sometimes think, oh, if I do this, the person is going to break my personal belonging, going to break my phone, going to smash my computer, that fear will stop the person from actually doing things. Now, your emotions are being manipulated. The fear is being manipulated for their gain, even if they choose to admit it or not. Now, the next one is gaslighting. I forgot to mention this. A lot of these different types could overlap at different times, but the general thing why we are differentiating it is for knowledge purpose so that we can really understand this concept of emotional abuse. Now, let's talk about gaslighting. I know this is a buzzword, but it's still an emotional abuse. Emotional abuse, abusers use manipulation tactics to gain control over the victim. Now, when the intention in gaslighting is to distort the person's perception of reality, making them question, am I going crazy? What is going on? Maybe I'm wrong, even when they are not. So, or maybe when they are not totally wrong. So you could hear getting ultimatums, threats, statement like after they've really done something that will hurt you, and you say, why are you making such a statement? This hurts me. And they're like, I was only joking. How can't you take a joke? Now, wow. And even when you say, okay, please stop, they will say, I know how to push your button. I will always push your button. I will always push your button. And they know it is obviously offending you. You then know you are not happy. And then they will say, you're always getting angry, Seth. But you have told them to stop. And they keep going. Or when they do certain things and they will say, I'm not I didn't know this was going to offend you. And you mention it and it keeps happening. This is a classic case of gaslighting. Now, the next one we're going to talk about is dismissiveness. This is a form of denial characterized by either passively showing indifference or disregard, or actively dismissing or rejecting a concern. I'm more comfortable with something. I'm deciding to speak about it. I don't like the way you speak to me in public. It actually affects how I feel about myself. And they say, you are being dramatic. Who cares about that? So sometimes they shake their head on you. Maybe when you're making a valid concern of how someone has been treating you, you're not comfortable with, and they're shaking their head. If you're in Nigeria, you'll get this look. They're doing like this. This is dismissing your feeling like it doesn't matter. And this is a form of emotional abuse. Now we talk about public embarrassment, where they would intentionally pick fights with you in public, share your secrets, or make fun of your faults, shortcomings in public. Some of our Nigerian parents or African parents can be guilty of this. Some are actually very awesome, and some of our parents didn't do this with any intention to emotionally abuse us, but the intent may not be that, but the effect is it's emotional abuse. Where you see a parent call out the shortcoming of a child in public. Ah, see this my daughter. She's always bedwetting. I've been talking to her. She's a bedwetter. Something that the girl is trying to manage. And the girl's crush is just by the side. How do you want her to cope? We may not want to admit it, but that is from some form of emotional abuse. Then we talk about stonewalling or withholding affection. When doing a disagreement, the person shuts down. You're trying to communicate, they shut down. I don't want to comment, they shut down. Now, there is a classic difference between stonewalling and withholding affection, and when the person is trying to, maybe the person has tried to communicate over time and you're not getting it, then the person decides, oh, let me shut down. But now, the difference there is if the person is trying to manage the conflict and not actually engaging in that conflict, the best way to do it is communicating. So at this time, I think we're not getting anywhere with the way we're going back and forth and emotions arising. Can we take out time to think about this and come back? Or like when the person is trying to communicate, the person communicates, talk, 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 and you don't answer. You answer maybe 2 days later, 1 week later, 3 days later, when you're comfortable. You're refusing to respond to the person's attempt to communicate. That is some form of emotional abuse. Now, of course, what are the effects of emotional abuse? Why do we need to make a fuss about it? Now, some of the effects is one, we can differentiate it into, yes, of course, short term effects and long term effects. Although some of the short term effects can trickle into long term effects, but we will classify a short term effect, of course, short term, very short period of time. I'm careful not to put a time frame to it because some will have the period of 2 weeks for you to classify it as short term, or some will have as 1 month or 3 months for you to classify it as short term. So I'm not going to put a time to it, but the key word between short term and long term is it is lasting. It still doesn't define, but it's lasting longer. That is now beginning to impair certain areas of the person's lives, and the person is not comfortable with it, and they really can't do anything about it. Now, that is long-term effects. Now, what are the short-term effects of emotional abuse? The first one is insomnia. Of course, we know insomnia is the loss of sleep, where you find it difficult to sleep. You don't know why, but you can't sleep, or your sleep pattern changes. You find yourself not sleeping in the daytime, or you find yourself not sleeping at night, but you can sleep in the daytime. But generally, insomnia, difficulty sleeping. Now, when you have various aches and pains in your body, like headache is part of it. You have pains in your hands, pains in your back. Now, most of these things come, especially when you have you have faced any of those types of emotional abuse we mentioned. Like when you notice that your chest is paining you much more than you would usually feel, that could also be a short-term effect. Now, isolation and loneliness. Loneliness is an effect and is a psychological effect. Loneliness can actually, we are social beings, so we need companionship, we need people. But when we are emotionally abused, sometimes it can affect our psyche and our perception of ourselves, that we don't want to mix with people. For example, we say, "Oh, I'm for nothing. I am no one." So there is no way anybody will want to interact with me. So you just isolate yourself. That is the short term effects. There's of course shame and guilt, where you walk around with your head down, unable to look people in the face, unable to talk because you feel, oh, the person said I'm worthless, then of course I'm worthless because of maybe something happened. That is some level of shame and guilt walking around, and you find it difficult to actually shake it off. Increased level of stress. Your stress levels increase, and of course, when the stress levels increase, there's also an increase in the stress hormones, which now goes on to influence how our general well-being is. Increase irritability with stop, snap, snap. You're beginning to stop, snap, snap, especially when you're finding it difficult to actually talk about it or express yourself to the emotional abuser. There is a tendency that you would transfer that aggression to some other people. Self-harm thoughts, and these thoughts could just be fleeting thoughts. Oh, I sure I should be here at all. I sure I should go through this. I sure I wouldn't end this. Wouldn't it be better for me to just end this? Oh, I sure I won't be doing the world a favor if I'm no longer here. Now the thought just comes in, but they don't have substantial purpose in you. They don't have strongholds in you. Now, difficulties concentrating, feeling powerless. I'm trying not to explain everything so we can round up so quickly. I think this are kind of self-explanatory. Frequent crying. We have crying spells, cry more than usual. Fear, like your heart beats when you hear them come through the door. Boom, boom. Your heart just goes boom, boom. Sorry, Nigerians, we like to demonstrate. Your heart beats like that. Fear is there. Then nightmares that keep you up at night or makes you wake up and you're scared, like it just keeps happening. Confusion. Then of course you're second guessing yourself. Do I know who I am? The intent of emotional abuse, I said it earlier, is to belittle the person. So when that happens over periods of time, of course the person starts second guessing themselves. Now we'll go to the long term effects. What are the long term effects of emotional abuse? Low self esteem. The object of the abuse would feel less of themselves. I am not as I should be. I am lesser than I should be. There is also anxiety and depression. Of course, a lot of studies have linked emotional abuse to feelings of anxiety and depression. Now, these are medical conditions. So is post-traumatic stress disorder. Post-traumatic stress disorder is the effect that comes after a traumatic experience. So sometimes we'll say, did they beat you? So why are you crying? It may seem like there is no physical, right? You didn't, but you have lost more. That now gives you you're becoming increasingly sensitive to certain situation. You're becoming irritable. You're finding it difficult to function. You're having flashbacks. You're having sleep disturbances. Like all this just comes together, and we look out for certain symptoms in these to be able to come to a decision that yes, it's PTSD at play here. So we talk about emotional dysregulation. Now, when someone has been emotionally abused for a while, the person finds it difficult to manage their emotions or control their emotions. And that's because, when they have been playing your emotions like ping pong, you take it, they take it, yeah, they take it, you kind of lose the control to actually regulate your own emotions. So when you are now faced with situation, it now leads to emotional dysregulation that you're finding it difficult to cope. Of course, social isolation, where isolation is one of the ways in which people emotionally abuse. So if they have abused people by segregating them from a group, after a while they just find themselves almost like an outcast in the group. Now we talk about self-harm and suicidal thoughts or attempts. Self-harm, maybe without the intent to commit suicide, maybe the cut of the hand, the burning of the ties. Those are types of self-harm. And suicidal thoughts. Now, these thoughts are more long-term effects because when we think about suicide, we think about it in grades. There's what we call the fleeting thoughts. It just comes through your mind, and yes, we brush it off. Then we start thinking about it extensively. It just keeps going through your mind. Then we now start giving it a lot of thought that we now start planning for it. Then we now stop planning, then we now start procuring the things we want to use. So the thoughts are generally thoughts, but they come in different categories. And of course, previous attempts are long term effects because we have realized that people with previous attempts are more affected. There's also the people pleasing tendency. When we've gone through some level of emotional abuse for a while, It's difficult being in that position where you have to always please someone, or where you are scared of what next would I do that the person would not be happy about. You're living on the edge, you're walking on eggshells. So subconsciously, especially if this thing happens at an earlier age, subconsciously we want to now develop a personality that doesn't displease people, that we now tend to generalize it to other people. So I don't want to be on your bad side. I don't want you to go AY. I don't want you to affect my own emotions. So I'm going to be nice. I'm going to do what you say. I'm not going to say no. I'm going to stress myself. I'm going to let you walk over me. They may not say this literally, but that is what a people pleasing tendency does. To walk over me so you are not angry with me or sad about it or anything. I'm going to please you at the detriment of myself all the time. That is people pleasing tendency. Frequent illness. When we are constantly in a state that our emotions are going all back and forth, our stress levels are increasing, we're becoming more irritable. And when all this comes together, you just notice you're always sick, always falling sick. It's a long term effect. There's also chronic pain and chronic fatigue syndrome. A lot of these long term effects are there when we talk about emotional abuse. Now, what are the self help tips to manage emotional abuse? Now, we would not expect everyone that has gone through emotional abuse to seek professional help. There are some of this emotional abuse, especially when we consider the intensity, the duration, that can be managed by ourselves. So, first thing we need to do is learn about what is emotional abuse, what is emotional trauma, and what are healthy relationship dynamics. Remember, we said in any relationship, emotional abuse can happen. So, by you watching this video, I think you are taking the first step to really understanding what is emotional abuse, what is emotional trauma, and what is healthy relationship dynamics. Then we want to acknowledge to ourselves that we are actually experiencing emotional abuse and understand that it's not your fault. It's also important for us to take stock of our own emotions and know if that if you're being triggered or this is actually an emotional abuse. Sometimes some things may happen with maybe a relationship, let's say a romantic relationship, and you're triggered, your emotions are triggered, and it may seem like the person is emotionally abusing you, but it's not. It's probably that you're being triggered. And if you don't take stock of your own emotions and know how you're being triggered, to be able to know if there are things you could undo yourself or if it's actually emotional abuse, can actually help. Also, let's reach out to trusted friends and family members or support groups to provide us with emotional support, validation, and understanding. Don't forget to prioritize your self care activities that promote your physical, emotional, and personal mental well being. We can't overemphasize that. We need to focus on ourselves a little bit more. Focus on you, and it will help you manage some of the effects. Pay attention to your exercise. Do things. I don't know what self care activities look like for you, so I'm not trying to dictate. I'm not trying to give you a list of yoga, meditation, journaling. No, do what works for you. Of course, we want to surround ourselves with positive and supportive people that will uplift and validate your experiences. I got someone share with me, a personal friend share with me to how she was always feeling a certain way when she went to social media. So she created a different account where she populated that account on Instagram with people that actually motivate her. And when she felt that she wanted to take a break off social media, yeah, she would take the break. But she always went there to revitalize, to reinvest in herself. And it made her have a positive outlook of life, other than the negative outlook she would have when she was um in certain space. Now, when we do that, it can actually help us validate our experience. For example, you'd know that you are not alone in this emotional abuse. You're not out of place to feel that your emotions are being invalidated. You're not out of place, and it helps you validate your experience. So you can do that physically or virtually. No peak. Choose the one that works for you and build on it. Now, you want to work on rebuilding your self esteem and self worth. Now, how can we do that? There are a lot of resources on the internet on that, and I would like you to take a shot at it. But one thing I know that stands tall when we're trying to build our self esteem and self worth is taking stock of what our strengths are and what our weaknesses are. If we are able to be truthful about that, we can be able to understand our strengths and capitalize on it, and understand our weaknesses and find a workaround on. Then we need to pay attention to the negative self talk and challenge those negative self talk. The most important story you would ever tell is the story you tell yourself. So if every time you speak to yourself, it's a negative talk. Imagine if I come to you every day, sweetheart, and I'm telling you you are not good enough every time. I don't think you will feel good about yourself. So it's important that even if they say it outward, you don't internalize it. And it's important for you to be able to separate it. Now, if you feel physically or emotionally unsafe in the situation, it's important for you to take a breather and don't act instantly. Develop a safety plan that you would follow so that you don't act instantly that it now, sorry, I'm going to use this word, you now enter from fry pan into fire. It's important for you to build a safety plan. Consider seeking therapy or counseling from qualified professionals who specializes in dealing with mental health conditions. And of course, how can we prevent emotional abuse? Now, the first thing we need to do is set clear and firm boundaries. What are boundaries? Boundaries are not things that we want to keep all people out, no, or everything out, no. Sometimes we want to see boundaries. Sometimes we want to see boundaries as something as like a punishment to somebody. Now, if you're seeing boundaries like a punishment to somebody, we're probably doing it all wrong. Boundaries are not for them, they are for us. So when we set clear boundaries, we are saying these are the things I want within my space. And I'm going to communicate that. And what takes us to the next point, clearly communicate your boundaries and expectation. Yes, sometimes they would not get it. Of course, they've been benefiting from emotionally abusing you for a while if you've been in that space. But you can reinstate it. Say it over time. Say the points, keep saying it in the best way that you can. Pay attention to how it's making you feel rather than going around talking about what the person is doing wrong. Because, as I said, boundaries are for you. I am not happy about how this is going. I would prefer we try this out. I would prefer you don't use these words on me. It makes me feel less than myself and I do not like it. Clearly. And you stick to that. We don't bring other things while we're setting boundaries. No, stick to the boundaries, stick to it, and set those firm boundaries. Now, the thing about boundaries is we need to know when to manage a boundary. I would just like to paint boundary as a wall we set off to protect ourselves from passerbys or people from the external community from entering into ours. If I build the fence, if I build a fence to a certain way, and I realize that after I built this fence, even people that I want to come in are not finding it easy to come in, I need to lower my fence because I know that I want certain people to come in. I don't want everybody because shutting out everything or everybody is not a good type of boundary. No, because we need people. But even people or behaviors that I want is not coming in, then it's a tendency that I may need to drop my boundary. Then if I drop the boundary and I realize it's allowing everything and anything to come in, I could make it up a little bit. And this will give us how and the ways in which we set our boundaries. So we need to also understand that boundaries are not absolute. Sometimes we would have to take down that boundary or reduce our step, especially when we feel it has achieved the purpose we wanted it to achieve. It's not absolute, it changes. So that is why we need to pay attention to our boundaries and manage it. So let's pay attention to our intuition and our gut feeling. Like when it's telling you that, oh, this person, red flags are there. The way they treat other people are there. You can see the way they talk to other people. Those are things you need to pay attention to, because the way they treat other people would most likely translate to how they see you or how they treat you at maybe after the relationship has gone for a while. And that's because people would usually act similar ways. Maybe not always, but there's a tendency that would happen. So it's important for us to pay attention to our intuition and our gut feelings. And when we do that, pay attention to how we can manage this, and like really pay attention and not jump into action, jump into conclusion. Pay attention, take notes, figure out how that is going to play out in an emotional abuse setting, and ask questions if you need to, rather than jumping into completion conclusion or mind reading them that you know what they're going to do. No, we don't. You have to talk about it or observe clearly. Now focus on cultivating healthy communication patterns. Now this is you, not them. Focus on you. People would only probably give you how much you're willing to take. So, if you're able to cultivate an healthy way to communicate what you want and don't want, it can actually help you manage and prevent emotional abuse. So, when you say it, you're able to communicate that quickly in the best way you can. Oh, I know you may mean well, but I don't like when you use those words against me, or when you use those words on me. I really don't like it, and I appreciate you don't repeat it. And of course, if it still happens, you look for a way to communicate that. And when you keep communicating that and it's not working, you know that relationship is not for you. But when you're communicating, you're focusing on how it's making you feel rather than what the person is doing wrong. Of course, for us to prevent emotional abuse, we also need to strengthen our self esteem, even when there is nothing. An emotional abuse will have a long effect on people that have weaker self esteem or self worth. And that's because the foundation is already shaken. So it's very much easier for things to break it down. So just like a prevention tactic, is important for us to continually strengthen our self esteem. Pay attention to the areas where you feel that your self-esteem is dribbling. It may be in social setting, work setting, religious setting, whatever. Pay attention to those different areas and strengthen them. Continually educate yourself about healthy relationship dynamics, red flags, and warning signs of emotional abuse. These things keeps changing. So we need to pay attention, especially with those emotional abusers that don't start immediately. Pay attention to when it starts starting, because when we educate ourselves, we know we're able to identify, "Ah, this is off." We watch it for a while, this is pointing that. But if we don't know, then it's very much likely that those warning signs will creep in. Examples of the warning signs you need to look for in emotional abuse: when the person is all controlling, how the person treats other people, when the person don't respect your own opinion, when the person makes subtle statements about you or things you care about. You need to pay attention to these warning signs that there's a tendency that this person could emotionally abuse. Of course, be open to new relationships. The thing with why emotional abuse happens to us is because we may be close to new relationship. Opening ourselves to new relationship can actually help us prevent emotional abuse. So, if you're struggling to heal from a past emotional abuse or find yourself repeating patterns in relationship, consider seeking therapy or counseling. A past emotional abuse needs to be dealt with, because what will happen is you may take that into a next relationship and thereby hurting, affecting that next relationship. So you need to heal from it. Secondly, you need to manage yourself so you don't repeat patterns in relationship. For example, I've seen people that have been emotionally abused and they now have preferences in romantic relationships. So people that do not give them butterflies in their stomach, they are not interested. But that butterflies in your stomach could just be a signal of anxiety when you're around that person. Or if that is the case, then and you keep repeating patterns, and maybe someone that talks to you in a subtle way, respectful way, um you're not appreciating that relationship, it's important that you know that there is something out of place. It is not how you should be doing things, even if you believe that is how you do things. That is not how you should. There is tendency that you're yet to heal from a past emotional trauma. So it's important for you to seek counseling or therapy, even when it doesn't seem like it's happening. Now, a word from 360 Psych, we call ourselves smart way to be better. We understand that an healthy mind, is an asset, and your mental health is just as important as any other challenge, and therefore but must not be neglected or sent under the carpet. We will appreciate if the fear of being stigmatized or stereotyped not be the reason why you would neglect your mental health. Sometimes, especially when in a community like the African community or the world in general, where they feel men should not be emotionally abused by women, they should be strong enough to take it. And then we don't want to talk about it because we are being scared of being stigmatized. That should not be the reason why you will keep deteriorating. It can be a battle, but you don't need to fight it alone. You should never walk alone. Seek help early, because early help actually increases the tendency of you flourishing even before you started. A final note, I like ending with this note. An apple a day keeps the doctor away. Smiling keeps wrinkles away. But when you feel out of place, I would love you to talk to a therapist. Thank you so much for your time, and I'll look forward to seeing you in our other videos. So we'll be doing this periodically, so please stay tuned, and would love to see your questions, and I'm open to answering any questions. I'm going to be answering them personally. Do have a lovely day.